Hello, everyone. Let's get started with the last session of the day. Thanks for joining our session. We're very happily surprised to see you all here. And what we want to talk about is what is available in CICD for Fabric nowadays and what is coming, which probably is the more interesting question, but let's see. First of all, like you probably saw several times today, but very important, our thanks to the sponsors. It's for both of us, it's the first time here. We're absolutely thrilled by the event. It's amazing. And we are super grateful to the sponsors to make this happen, because without the sponsors, we couldn't be here, and we enjoy our time very much. I'm Gabi. I'm a member of the Fabric Customer Advisory Team at Microsoft. A few other members from my team are actually here, and we enjoyed very much being here, spending time with you. And yeah, handing over to Matthias.
Thanks, Gabi. Hope you can hear me okay. Equally excited to be here. Thanks for joining last session of the day. So I'm Matthias, Data Platform MVP. I run a small consultancy in London. You may know me as a developer of PBI tools. I did a thing called Timdal recently, which you may have heard about. Definitely very excited to talk about CICD in the context of Fabric. There's lots to share, lots to discuss. Let's get started. So before we go into demos and practical stuff, just a few basic concepts to go through. First of all, what is CICD? Arguably,
maybe before you start, who knows what CICD is or is working with Git integration CICD already? Okay, so we will keep the conceptual part as short as possible while discussing as much as needed, but just glad to see that. We both remember times when CICD in BI or data wasn't a thing, you know?
Very true indeed, absolutely. And it's certainly been a learning curve for us, for the platform, for the community as a whole. And as you'll see later, we're still very much in learning mode. So CICD, two rather obscure concepts, somehow related, continuous integration, continuous deployment. Ultimately, it relates to agility when it comes to pushing changes into production. The CI bit is all about integrating things at a source code level. The CD bit is all about actually deploying and moving your model, your report, your notebooks, pretty much any sort of artifact you're working with to your end users. And some related concepts we wanted to mention as well are DevOps and the sisters and brothers, DataOps and GitOps. Again, very frequently used terms, a bit vague with respect to how you distinguish them. So we made a little attempt here in terms of actually drawing a really clear line. I'm not going to read all of this out, but at the end of the day, DevOps is about source code as much as DataOps is about data assets, and GitOps is about infrastructure. And if you look on the far right in that table, you'll see that we actually have different actions we care about in those contexts. So.
And one thing, because you mentioned that we won't read out everything on the slides, we will share the slides after the session, of course. So you feel free to take pictures if you want to, but you don't have to.
Yeah, very good. And let me just point out a few things relating to DataOps, because obviously that's what we ultimately care about. DataOps arguably is one of the hardest bits amongst those three, because when it comes to collaborating around data assets, deploying them into different environments, performing automated deployments, performing tests. It's a bit of a tricky story because we have a distinction between metadata and data, which we don't really have in other contexts like mere software or mere infrastructure. Just talking about Git and source control, a few concepts to be aware of are branches and commits, and we generally have a concept of a so-called main branch, which represents sort of the most stable or production-like version of a system, a project, and we usually use alternative branches to perform changes on those. If we look at the end of this, we'll see that there is usually a structured process with respect to how those changes get back into our main branch, how they get back into production. It's not something we just move in there. It's something where we normally use a so-called pull request, which has a process, a review process, et cetera, et cetera. But as we said, we didn't want to go into the theory too much. Just one final thought on this. Another very common concept is to have staged deployments. That's something which we're going to see very practically, really shortly. And one of the most common models is to distinguish 3 different stages: development, test, and production. There are good reasons for that. So just mentioning that here as well. But let's look at Fabric. Let's look at what there is today.
Exactly. And in the story of CICD and Fabric, we are typically distinguishing between 3 different approaches. So first of all, who of you already worked with Fabric when we still called it Power BI? Cool. Who of you missed Git integration or any proper source code integration or any kind of CI/CD in Power BI? Cool, thanks. So Git integration is the term I already mentioned. So this is really giving you the opportunity to integrate into a source code tool, into a source code provider, and not use OneDrive, SharePoint Online, or whatever you used to actually keep the versioning of your files in the past. This is something which currently is supported with Azure DevOps and is in preview, public preview actually. And the concept that is existing or was already existing and in GA in Power BI times is deployment pipelines. One thing we will look at in one of the demos later on. And that is especially addressing the staged approach that we just saw before. So actually the application lifecycle management, really making sure that you have a process to bring your deployments, your changes to production in a staged approach and in a controlled way. Well, and of course, there's APIs because everything we do is based on APIs. So even our internal tools are using those APIs, which also means we have public APIs that are documented and meant for public use. There are internal APIs, which we sometimes get asked by customers, well, we found those APIs mentioned when we track the traffic. Can we use them? Well, we cannot prevent that, but there is a reason why it's not documented and not public and not supported. And if we change something, then your processes will break. But of course, we are using APIs in the background as well. And APIs are, let's say, the the Swiss knife that allow you to actually close the gaps, or hopefully close the gaps that the native integration sometimes still leave open. Git integration is based on a workspace level. So workspace still the main concept in Fabric to actually collaborate and work. You can assign a Git repository to a workspace, or actually it's a branch of a Git repository, and you can sync your changes from Git to Fabric and back. As I already mentioned, at the moment we only have Azure DevOps as the Git provider that is supported, and we don't have all items supported as of now. So we have, like we can see here, Power BI semantic models and reports, not all semantic models, also something we will talk about later on. We have notebooks and lake houses, and some newer items are pipelines, and there is more to come. But there is not everything available yet. Another gap we are very, very distinctly aware of and something we need to change, but it's a journey. We are trying to close those gaps as soon as possible. And the important thing about Git integration is the versioning that I was speaking about. So when you actually perform changes, you want to have the opportunity to roll them back if something went wrong. You want to have the opportunity to actually compare different versions and have the opportunity to understand what has been changed, to really do that. Especially when you're working with multiple developers on the same project, you really want to understand the changes. And if multiple developers are performing changes at the same point in time, you want to merge those changes. You can run into conflicts, and you want to be able to resolve those conflicts. Deployment pipelines, as I mentioned, is the already existing approach, or the historical approach that is not actually meant for the source code integration, but for the continuous deployment, really bringing your development from development to test to production, or whatever additional environment or layer you want to have configured in your environment. It also allows you, yes? Yeah.
Do you know when to the built-in Git workspace integration will work together with GitHub?
That is something we will talk about later. Just keep it open. It's something we will discuss. For the ALM, it's also important to understand what are the differences between the versions in your different layers. And yeah, you can create pipelines between 2 and 10 stages. So according to how you want to define this. So if, for example, between test and production, you have a pre-prod environment, that's something which you can configure. And Fabric APIs, something we will talk about later, already mentioned. It will allow you to do different things like managing your workspaces, managing your items, managing deployment pipelines, for example. So different aspects that can help you to actually design your processes in exactly the same way that you want to have them. And that might differ from the native processes that are integrated. But we also have a few new announcements, and yeah, I already mentioned we had a set of items that were already supported, let's say before the current semester started. We recently announced that there are a few items that will be added, both to Git integration and deployment pipelines. Not everything landed yet, but at least those are the items we are aware of will be available in a very reasonable amount of time. Let's say it like this. And yeah, so if you follow thoroughly, there is still a lot of items missing. Not everything resolved yet, but it's a continuous work that we do and we are working on.
Can I just come in here for one
Sure.
second? So even though some items do show up with a green tick here, we will see shortly that it's very nominal in terms of those item types being supported, and sometimes it's more a shell rather than any more than that. So just to curb your enthusiasm a little bit.
So as you probably can see, our roles are a little bit predefined. You're challenging. I'm trying to defend at least a little bit, but to be honest, I can sometimes only defend by saying this will be coming, because honestly, it's not there. Matthias?
Yes. So two bits to point out in particular, which are available are and actually have been available only since quite recently, are APIs to automate Git integration itself. So it's quite meta, actually. Remember, Git integration is a new Fabric UI feature, which works at the workspace level. There are now APIs which allow you to actually automate those various steps of setting up and using Git integration. That's one thing. And then also very, very new are Fabric-specific deployment pipeline APIs. We've had Power BI deployment pipeline APIs for a while. They still work. They're still obviously supported, but they are explicitly limited to Power BI-specific item types. If you want to use deployment pipelines for Fabric items, you need to use the new Fabric deployment APIs. So it's all sort of a bit confusing, which is why we're trying to make some sense of stuff.
And yeah, the branching out is another new feature. Just leave it. The branching out is another new feature. And maybe one quick comment on the a little bit confusing. 100% agreed. Just again, maybe defending a little bit. We need to make sure that we keep our customers that have solutions in production as of today with deployment pipelines that already existed, being able to continue their progress. It's always the challenge. If you change a running system, you need to ensure that everything already running is still going to work and to exist while performing all the necessary changes. And sometimes it might be easier to just develop two versions side by side and then actually switch over or make it easy to switch over. But yeah, new workspace branches. You already mentioned the branching concept when we talked about the Git concept. And especially when we are working with multiple developers, we have our development stage, but we want to give every developer the opportunity to actually develop in their own branch, to actually perform their changes and test their changes unmolested by any other developer working at the same point in time. And that we typically try by creating feature branches. So actually a copy of the development branch at the moment when the developer starts their work. And then this kind of integration will become more automated, more natively integrated by giving you the opportunity to create a feature branch out of the Fabric Git integration UI, which will create a branch in Git. It will create a new workspace. It will deploy all the metadata automatically to the workspace. And when you're done, well, at the moment, you have to get back to actually ADO, perform a pull request to get your changes, merge it back into the development branch, and then you can continue from there. So again, it's like a first step into bringing this kind of functionality into the native integration. And of course, there's always potential for more, but I think it's a good signal of us listening to that and trying to actually follow through.
That is part of this new feature, which actually, just to highlight this a little bit, it's a very exciting new feature. I did see a demo of it. If we have time, we will also show a pre-recorded demo later, but it all depends on how many questions there are. It's a very exciting concept to basically think of an entire workspace as a unit of work with respect to a Fabric data system, and to be able to go in as a developer and effectively fork an entire workspace, not just within your Fabric capacity, but at the same time within your source code solution. And the screenshot we've got here is part of that new experience, where ultimately you're going to be able to see how many basically parallel forks there are of your current project, and actually where they reside with respect to other workspaces. Do we know about timelines for that? No, soon. All right, here we go. Cool. So before we actually go into a Fabric workspace, just one final sort of general thing. We wanted to talk about three practical scenarios, how you can actually set up CICD with Fabric today using all those features we've discussed so far. The most simple one would be one like this, where you basically use Git integration, so that's bottom left, and use mostly the Fabric UI to edit and create and develop your notebooks and lakehouses and everything else that's related. Then use Git integration to get that one synced into a central code repository. And you use, can I actually point with this? Ah, there we go. That much better. Right. So you sync your local, you sync your individual development into a feature branch, and then ultimately use a process to get that integrated into main branch. At which point you then we then take over with a stage deployment process, and in this case that would be entirely reliant on deployment pipelines. So basically usage of Git ends here. We sync from Git into a development workspace, and from development over to test and production we use deployment pipeline. That has is relatively straightforward. We have a bunch of exciting features we can take advantage of here, particularly around deployment rules, which we'll see in a second. And that is something which is available today and ticks quite a few boxes. Did you want me to go through the other ones as well? Awesome. So a slightly more advanced version of that would be a setup that is more or less the same. So we basically do new development in a dedicated workspace. We use feature branches which ultimately get merged into main, and we rely on a stage deployment in shared workspaces, where again we go from dev to test to production. The only difference here is that we don't use deployment pipelines in terms of triggering those deployments. Instead, we rely entirely on our CI server, in this case, Azure DevOps, which is why we mention the fact that there are Fabric APIs to control deployment pipelines. So that has the added advantage that we can use orchestration features in Azure DevOps, i.e. we can perform additional actions like running notebooks, running pipelines, and we can actually also integrate things like testing. For instance, run Tabular Editor, Best Practice Analyzer, or other testing frameworks. So that's slightly more advanced, but in principle also available today. And then number 3, where we effectively don't use deployment pipelines at all, and where everything is code-driven. So this is the solution that relies on a branching model and on source control much more, and it relies a lot more on custom logic in your Azure DevOps or GitHub or whatever CI system you want to use. We're not going to show that today, just wanted to mention it for sort of just to have a full picture here. But let's see what Gabi has come up with.
Exactly. And coming back to that, well, scenario one was like, if you want to compare to our democratization aspect, scenario one with deployment pipelines is completely UI supported. So it might be called the citizen developer friendly version. The scenario three, the completely Git based, is like the complete pro dev one. And scenario two is like a mixture of both, which means this is the ideal scenario for us to build on our demos on, because we want to show you both aspects. Maybe one additional comment. In an ideal world, you don't have to decide for one scenario for your full company. You can decide project by project, team by team, which scenario makes sense, because it's not like you have to take a decision and then this will be used, or you can only use that one scenario for your full tenant. As all of this is tied on a workspace level, you actually can decide workspace by workspace or project by project what actually fits your audience or your authoring team best. Okay, so switching to the demo, not already going to the limitations. Well, let's be honest, there are limitations and we want to show them and not only talk about them. So I will start with bringing up the first bit. So actually starting from a blank workspace, showing Git integration in dev, showing how we set up a deployment pipeline. And in the second part of the demo, Matthias will do the automation part. So in this, again, we're also switching roles. I'm the citizen developer, happy to be that. Matthias will be the pro dev. So what we see here is a workspace, and let's not think about how we set this up. It's not an architecture session here. We just want to rely on we just want to demonstrate the Git functionality. First is, this looks like a normal workspace that you probably are aware from, even from Power BI times. Okay, now we also see the rest of the Fabric items in here, but there is nothing that indicates any kind of relationship, any kind of Git integration or anything else. So what we can do now is we can actually switch to the workspace settings, and the workspace settings actually show us a new setting, or it's not that new any longer, but a setting that allows us to define the Git integration for this workspace. And what you're doing here is, I already have my DevOps account used in this project several times. So my user is actually allowing me to automatically select the account I'm connected with. I can select the organization, the project, the Git repository, and the branch. And again, that is what we said before. We can connect a workspace not only to a Git repository, but to a dedicated branch inside the Git repository. I even could create a new branch here, but in this scenario, I'm just selecting the main branch. You can even add additional Git folders if you want to follow a certain structure, if you have certain best practice rules. But for this demo, we just connect and sync. And now you're seeing a few small changes happening here. First of all, we get a new column with the Git status, which actually shows you if items are synced with your Git repository. And all the item types that are not as of today supported, I don't have anything in here, but it would show up as unsupported at the moment. So it's clearly obvious from that column which items are actually supported and which aren't. In addition, on the upper right side, you have your source control bar, which allows you to open the menu, which will give you information about your sync status. So when you perform changes, you will see the changes here, which you can then commit using the typical approaches with commit comments and all of that. You can cherry pick for commits and all of that. Updates on the other side is the other side. So if your Git repository would contain changes that are not reflected in your workspace, that is something which you also would see here, and that would allow you to sync those changes or to pull those changes to your workspace. And the last thing is on the lower left, you will also see the Git integration symbol, just showing that quickly, and the information which branch actually your workspace is connected to. So,
if I may,
sure.
So one thing to take away with Git integration, which is actually really powerful and very, very nice about it, it works two ways, right? So what you did see earlier was we've got an existing Git repository that contains basically the representation of a Fabric workspace. We can link that to any workspace and it will be brought over. We can also go the other way. You can make any changes within the workspace and have it pushed by Git integration fully automatically back into your repo. So very, very neat idea and a very nice concept.
And what we just saw is I now switched over to Azure DevOps, and I performed a refresh before this repository that I just connected was completely empty. Now we actually see the items from the workspace being reflected in that repository. So exactly what we did. Well,
do you want to show the lake first?
Being reflected, coming back to what Matthias said before, some items are more or less only a shell. That would be one of the examples. But, well, you can't have everything, obviously. But yeah, it's at least they are already there. And Matthias will talk a little bit in his part of the demo why and how we would need to deal with that. But, well, you see a reflection of what is already there. Okay, getting back to the workspace, we now have our workspace, our development workspace connected with Git on the two-way sync, something we won't discuss in detail today, but would especially be interesting when you're a Power BI developer and want to work with Power BI desktop and project files. This will also be an additional aspect which is interesting there. But just mentioning there is a lot of usefulness for that one. But this time, or in this demo, we want to create a deployment pipeline because we want to actually add our additional stages. So, of course, a deployment pipeline needs a name. So we call this SQL Day CICD Dev. Not very creative, but it's okay. And then we are in the section where you can actually define the stages for your deployment pipeline. In the past, you had the fixed 3 stages of dev, test, and production. Nowadays, you could add additional stages or delete stages. So again, between 2 and 10 are actually available. For this purpose, for this demo, it's completely okay to keep it that way, but you can change it and you can name them in the way that you want them to be named. After we create those stages, you have the opportunity to decide if you want to assign your existing workspace to any of the stages. So you can not only assign this at the first step, you can also assign already existing workspaces to all the other stages. So if you already had like different workspaces available, which you used for different versions by manually running this ALM, you could now switch to deployment pipelines and make sure that you reuse what is already there, but you don't have to. In this case, we start by assigning the workspace to our dev stage. And now we get a visual representation of our 3 stages with information. At the moment, it all looks relatively empty, but I think it's a good visual representation which shows you in my development layer, I have my workspace, which is also a link which I could just open. It gives me the information in an aggregated view and in a detailed view, which kind of items I have available in that workspace. And I could even publish a workspace app from here. So the important thing here is this feature is meant to actually give you all the functionality that you need for this ALM, but with the UI support to make it as easily to use that even a business user, a citizen developer who doesn't have all that background information about Git integration, about ALM, can find it relatively intuitive to work with this, and also especially run everything from a UI and not need to go into kind of scripting, batch mode, Azure DevOps, whatever. And that is the part which makes it pretty attractive here. What we now want to do is we want to create our test stage and deploy to it. And that is the bit where, well, we have to pay a price for doing everything in the UI because, of course, you still need to configure something. And what we can do is we can just, from the dev workspace, deploy first time to our test stage. We can also add deployment comments here. So in this case, I will only say initial deploy. And what is happening is if I didn't assign a dedicated workspace, Fabric will create a blank new workspace for me. It will use the stage name in the workspace name text to actually make sure that this is understandable. And I, as the creator of this deployment pipeline and as creator of the workspace, will become administrator of this workspace, but nobody else. So at this moment, I'm the admin of the deployment pipeline. I'm the admin of the test workspace. If I want anybody else to collaborate, I need to assign permissions, or of course, the service admin can always do this. With deployment pipelines, they can do this, but only using APIs. There is no UI support for that. It's possible. It's not super intuitive. So, and now I'm seeing my test workspace. I can just open my test workspace and look at the workspace. And of course, I'm seeing the exact same items that I had in my dev workspace. This is actually as expected. If I'm now looking at the lineage view, what I can see now is, well, again, all of this looks pretty obvious, pretty much as expected. But what is a little bit, no, I'm not seeing, okay.
Well, it's pretty exciting, right? So we have a complete clone of our workspace, don't we?
Yes.
We have, well, what's in our lake houses? Do you want to have a look there?
Yeah, that's the nice bit. Thanks for pointing this out. So let's look at our Silver Lake house. Oh, by the way, one interesting thing before we actually go into this, you see that we have two notebooks here. Before we look into the lake house, just one thing to point out. We have two notebooks here. If we do the same thing on the dev workspace, just for a comparison, if we switch to lineage, your lineage, no, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to switch to lineage. Your lineage looks slightly different. So you also see the two notebooks, transform data for silver, transform data for gold, and they are connected to the sales silver lakehouse in the same workspace. If I'm looking here, they are still connected to the lakehouse in my dev workspace. So that is one of the challenges we are facing.
Oops.
The other challenge we are facing, and now taking Matthias on what he already mentioned, if we look into the lakehouse, well, tables, files, everything empty. If we look at the same lakehouse in the dev workspace, we see shortcuts in the files and a table in the table section. So again, like we saw in the Git integration, this is mostly a shell as of today. So if you want to have the same approach, you would need to rerun your data integration workloads to actually populate the lakehouse with the data, with the files, with the tables that you want to see.
And if I may, also, I think it's important to stress that this is not necessarily a problem or a bug or limitation. It's a concept. It's a decision. When we looked at the source code representation earlier, where we basically saw an empty definition of our lakehouse, that is what the deployment pipeline sees, right? Everything that's visible to us in Git integration is also what's visible to the deployment pipeline. Because we're dealing with data assets here, we do have to distinguish in our minds and conceptually what is a data container and what is the data contained in the container, right? And deployments here are merely about metadata. If I then want to have a semantic model that contains data, I need to run a refresh on it. All Power BI people will be very familiar with that. If I want to have a lakehouse that has tables and files in it, I need to run some process, you know, a data pipeline or a notebook or whatever I'm using in order to populate it, right? So I think there's quite a good parallel here. Thinking of a Power BI world, you know, where we move semantic models to different workspaces and still have to orchestrate our data refresh. The same thing applies here. But it means that there are sort of extra things to worry about in terms of process, and we're not just clicking a button and getting everything for free.
Correct. And what Matthias just said, not everything of this can be solved in the deployment pipeline natively. So we cannot trigger the actual data integration workloads to be executed from here. But one thing we can change is the difference in lineage that we were seeing. Because, of course, if I deploy my workspace from dev to test, I want my notebooks to be connected to my test lakehouse instead of my dev lakehouse. And the tool that we can use to do this is the so-called deployment rules. It allows you to define certain rules that are applied to the items from their way from dev to test or test to production. And with the notebooks, what we can do here is we can create a deployment rule for the default lakehouse. So in this scenario, we're just adding a new rule. We are saying this is my lakehouse reference that I had in development, showing to my sales silver lakehouse in dev. And now, and that is the strange thing, and I just remembered I forgot to ask why. It's showing up with me all the time. There is another at the bottom of this list. The other one is the interesting one, because here you can actually define the lakehouse that you want to connect to.
That's very painful today. You actually have to find those GUIDs and you have to paste them in there and have to make sure not to mix them up or have a typo or anything.
Correct. And therefore, I'm always opening the one and selecting the GUIDs from here.
But it's a one-off thing. You only need to do that once when setting up the deployment pipeline for the first time. And hopefully from that point on, you can just run it over and over again. Yes, think about how many stages you want to set up.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. I was considering maybe only one, but I decided to do it only for one, but to show you actually two. So we're doing the same thing for the second notebook. Oh, no, that's the one I already did. Yeah, I'm sorry. The second notebook, that's the one at rule. Sales silver. I already have the lakehouse. You know, clicking through that when doing the demo live is always a little bit more time consuming than when you're doing it before.
No.
This is purely deployment pipeline in this case. No alignment with Git. Yes. Yes. Specifically in this scenario, you need to do it because the lakehouse I'm now referencing, the silver lakehouse in the test workspace, didn't exist before. So I don't have the GUIDs, cannot reference. But as you can see here in the other workspace, the deployment rules are not yet defined. If you would assign, I don't know, any kind of random workspace, they would get activated. So you could just add a blank workspace. And if the deployment rules are, for example, referring to an external data source, for example, you could already do that. But in this case, as we don't have this available, as we are just creating the resource for the first time, it wouldn't work. The interesting bit now is I didn't perform any updates. I didn't perform any changes to the test or the dev stage, but still my comparison is now showing me that there is a difference between the two changes. And when I run the compare, it shows me that there is a difference between the notebooks. And the difference in this case is I created deployment rules. So the engine is expecting a certain difference between the two stages. And when I'm now redeploying the whole process, then this change will actually be applied. After the deployment is done, it will actually show you that everything will look the same. So everything will be green. Yes. Waiting for the green. Okay. And if I now go back to my workspace and refresh my lineage view, you can see that now my notebooks are actually also referring the lakehouse in my test workspace. So this is something which works for, and for the sake of time, just saying the rest out loud. This is something which works for notebooks, but only for the default lakehouse, not for additional metadata references. It works for your semantic models, for example, working for certain data sources, but there's other aspects that don't work as well. So if you have a Power BI report, a thin report, for example, you don't have a deployment rule to change the relationship to the semantic model. So again, there's a few things that work pretty nice as of today. There's a few things that are still missing. And with that, maybe let's hand over to Matthias to actually discuss if there is an option to actually change this. And well, the look is not that different, even though we are now on a different notebook.
Awesome. Right. I'm going to have to be fairly swift on that one. My apologies. But what I wanted to show are a few examples where we've hit hard limits with respect to Git integration and deployment pipelines. And I just wanted to show you some examples how you can still get around them today. I've got effectively the exact same setup here, the exact same workspace, only in addition, I have a semantic model and I have a report on top of that. And in fact, obviously, because we're in a Fabric world and we've got our data in Lakehouse and all of that, of course, we're using Direct Lake here. All the...
well, I had another demo. I had another demo which I skipped with the direct query data set, which just saying that would have worked perfectly. But Matthias decided to take a Direct Lake semantic
right, so
model,
there we go. Yes, I was very keen on Direct Lake, and as you can see, it's super responsive and very cool. Excuse my report building skills. But we actually have a problem here quite quickly. First of all, look here. So this is my semantic model, right? This is my Git status. This one is not even in the picture, right? So Direct Lake models are not even supported by Git integration today, and they're just ignored. I already have a deployment pipeline set up.
Soon.
I already have a deployment pipeline set up for this, and if we look at that, we don't even see the semantic model, but we do see the report, which is the nice report I just showed you. Now, if I actually go ahead and say, sync my changes from dev to test and click deploy, I'm going to be disappointed very quickly because since that report is based on a direct lake semantic model, it actually breaks my deployment pipeline. So, just two examples where we actually hit hard limits. Now, what can we do in terms of still taking advantage of CICD and source control for those two items? Number one, for the report, I can go to my beloved tabular editor. That's a V2, so the free version available to anyone. And I can actually, I can actually connect to this workspace, which is that one. There we go. And I can connect to my direct lake semantic model, which happens to be this one. It's just called sales. So this one has my complete model definition in here. In fact, I've got a single shared expression called database query, because that's how direct lake models work. I can now easily get into the source control world by actually using something called Timdal. You may have heard of it, and save this model to my local to a local folder. I've got this here. So there we go. So this is a Timdal representation of my model. It looks pretty familiar, and with that, I can now take advantage of well-established existing tools around XMLA and Tom in terms of deploying that. However, I had a pretty hard time making this work because, well, I don't think I've got time to go into it. Good. So it's good practice in a CICD automated world to use service principals, as you may know, instead of actually using usernames and passwords for existing users. There are some limits today with respect to having a deployment, having a service principal that owns a direct lake model, because the identity of the owner is used in order to make the lakehouse connection. And right now, there's just no support for service principals with respect to lakehouses and other Fabric items. However, there's a workaround here. You can create a shared connection, and you can actually bind that model to a shared connection, and that makes it work. Just to cut the story short, I've got an example here where basically I'm using PBI tools to take my Timdal sources to bind this one to a shared data source as part of a deployment. And also at the same time, I'm changing my lakehouse connection dynamically, again, as part of the deployment. So let me just run this very quickly. I've got a workspace selected here, which is different from my deployment pipeline workspace. So if I go here and go to model test, what will happen is it will basically take the Timdal sources for my direct lake model. It will push it up to my new separate workspace. it will connect it to a shared data source and ultimately allow me to have a process where a service principal performs the deployment and owns the model. Just going back here, my workspace is this one, and I've got a brand new model, which is this. Now, if I try to get some data from it, come on. If I try to get some data from it, it will, it's probably just connection. It will tell me that it needs a refresh. Okay, well, there we go, live demo. Let me just try once more.
And the challenge here is also, in the sake of time, we really try to think of all the things we wanted to show you. The two of us would love to discuss that for a few more hours with you and show you everything you can do live and all the changes. Unfortunately, we don't have 3 hours and you all want to go to the party, which I can understand. So unfortunately, we will need to switch to one more thing.
One more thing.
One more thing.
Yeah. Just very quickly, we saw the report, which was not available in Git integration and in deployment pipelines. I just wanted to point out one very cool VS Code extension, which a friend in Austria, Gerhard, kindly made available to the community. That one allows us to actually link a view of a Fabric workspace into VS Code, and it allows us to effectively download the underlying sources for semantic models, for pipelines, notebooks, reports, and Spark jobs. Those are the 5 items which are currently supported by Fabric APIs. Here I basically have my full report definition, which again I can now deploy using automated processes into my workspace. I'm just going to do that very quickly as well. Just going back here, and then we can wrap this up. So if I say sales 5, here we go. Okay, that should work or not. Okay, right. One second. Yeah, it was meant to be sales 5. Let's leave it here and switch over there.
And sorry, with only 1 minute to go, I will quickly go through the limitations and the roadmap. And again, we will share the slides, so you will get all of this. And we actually mentioned that the list is not complete. We try to pick a few very important topics we think are there. And like we mentioned, changing connections, support for service principals. One thing we didn't show, shortcuts, one of the most important features in Fabric, are currently not supported as part of that automation. But we're working on that, also mentioning the other Git providers. We hear the feedback. We're taking that very seriously. Our roadmap will already answer a few of those questions and gaps. So we had the question about GitHub support. So we don't have a timeline yet. We announced at FabCon that we start working on this during this semester. When this will actually land, we cannot tell of today, but we will add support for additional items. We will add support for service principals. We will add support for folders in Git integration, another new feature that we didn't show here. So several of those aspects will be addressed in the next few months. And we hear that feedback. We love more of your feedback coming to us because it's important for us which of the gaps we need to close are the most important ones. Because some, like Matthias showed, can be solved with seeing on the limitation list with APIs or custom code, but not all of them. We are trying to close those first to give you the full functionality, and making it more comfortable is probably the second step. I hope that makes sense. But again, bring us your feedback. It's super important for us to understand what's your priority. And with that, thanks so much for taking your time. Enjoy the rest of the day and the party.
Thank you very much.